So I would say, well, without free speech, there's no true thought. And then you might say, well, who the hell cares whether or not we think? And I think the answer to that is fairly straightforward. I mean, you might think it's so obvious that it doesn't need explanation, but there are very few things that are so obvious they don't need explanation. So the reason you think is so that the world doesn't smack you as hard as it might, fundamentally, you know, and I really mean this technically, because the way that people evolved the capacity to thought was that the prefrontal cortex, which mediates a lot of voluntary linguistic ability, actually emerged over the course of evolutionary history out of the motor cortex. And so that's a very interesting thing to understand, because it means that, you know, animals basically think by moving. And the problem with that is if you think by moving and you make the wrong move, then you're dead. Whereas what human beings can do is they can generate fictional avatars of themselves in fictional worlds, and they can run the avatars as simulations, and the ones that get killed they don't express in behavior. And I mean, you can do that with words too, although people, you know, originally would have done it mostly with images. They do the same thing with drama. And so the reason that you think, and I think it was was it Alfred North Whitehead that said this, I think, but I'm not absolutely sure. The reason you think is so that your thoughts can die instead of you. And that's a brilliant phrase, and absolutely the case. So if you think properly, then you kill off the ideas that if you acted out would kill you, or at least cause you suffering, or perhaps cause suffering to the people around you. And since it's more or less obvious a priori that suffering is worse than not suffering under most circumstances, it seems reasonable to act in a manner that will minimize it to the degree that that's possible. And so you need clarity of thought, because that helps guide you through a world that's enshrouded in fog and full of sharp objects. And if you don't want to stumble into them and impale yourself, then you should have sharp vision and sharp capacity to communicate. And, you know, that's one of the things I tell students when I'm trying to teach them to write, because no one ever tells them why they should learn to write. It's like, you learn to write so you can think, and you learn to think so that the world doesn't treat you any more harshly than it absolutely has to. And that's no joke, you know. And if you're a person who's been around a bit, you see very rapidly that people who sharpen their arguments properly and can articulate their position and defend it are always the people who are most successful and most compelling, and that change the way structures function, and that also help things continue in the proper path when they're running down the proper path. It's no joke to be articulate and to be able to think. There isn't anything that's more powerful than that. And that's a good segue into the second or the third part of what I wanted to talk to you about. You see, since I made those videos, I've become, I guess the word is popular on, yeah, well, in many ways. By about November, by the end of November last year, there were more than 200 newspaper articles about the consequences of the videos that I'd produced, and those were like in-press printed articles. I'm not talking about anything that happened on YouTube, and YouTube is a very strange phenomenon, let me tell you. It's far more powerful than you think. So just as an aside, I was on a program last week hosted by a guy named Joe Rogan. I don't know how many of you know who Joe Rogan is, but Joe Rogan gets 1.2 billion downloads of his podcasts a year. You just think about that. Like, that's absolutely unparalleled. And everybody under 30 is getting their news from either Facebook or from YouTube. And the whole conventional media sources, they're so dead you can hardly believe it. So YouTube, and one of the reasons I'm bringing it up is because YouTube is the first platform that's produced for people the capacity to make the spoken word as far-reaching and permanent as the written word. Right? That's a complete cultural revolution. It's the first time it's ever happened. I mean, it wouldn't have to be YouTube. It just turns out that that's the platform that got there first. But it's a big deal. And anyways, the reason that I became popular, I think, was partly because of the political, philosophical videos that I made. But then when people came to my website to watch them, they stayed, generally speaking, to watch the lectures that I had been posting on there since 2013. And those were derived from work I did on a book called Maps of Meaning, which I published in 1999. And you see, what I was trying to do with that book was to sort something out that was very complex, and that was when I was growing up and the Cold War was raging. I couldn't understand precisely why we had divided into two armed camps around our respective ideological positions, either why those ideological positions were so important that people would risk the destruction of the world to protect them, let's say, or why it was those two particular ideologies, or whether or not this was just a difference of opinion, right, that would be a more postmodern view, is there's multiple ways that you can organize societies. In the West, we happen to organize our society one way, but that's one of a plethora of potential ways of organizing society, and let's say the communists had decided to organize their society another way, and human beings are infinitely malleable, and so, you know, the social structures that we occupy are arbitrary in some sense, and matter of opinion, and maybe collective opinion, but nonetheless still a matter of opinion. And I thought, well, is it the case that the values that we hold to be true in the West are merely based upon opinion? And so I started to investigate that, and the conclusion that I came to as a consequence of hitting the question from multiple different perspectives was that that was not a reasonable way of formulating, of interpreting the evidence. And so I looked at evidence from neuropsychology and neuroscience, mostly based at least in part on the work of someone named Jeffrey Gray, who was a very good psychologist, very interested in anxiety. I looked at general behavioral psychology, looked at literature, and I looked at mythology. And I could see a pattern emerging across all of those, which I think is a nice way of determining whether or not something exists. Like, it's one thing to see a pattern in one set of data, but if you can see the same pattern in another set that's quite historically distinct from the first, and then see the same pattern in another set, and then another set, then the probability that that's a spurious pattern starts to decrease quite radically.
如果您也喜欢这样的生活智慧，请帮我按赞、订阅并打开小铃铛。您的关注是我们最大的动力。